concept is imprecise and of limited use. And that is the paradox that remains with us today. It is a paradox that he himself defined for the field of evolutionary biology and population genetics beginning in the 1930s. And it is a paradox that we saw going back to my first couple of slides when you could see Francis Collins, who now incidentally is head of the NIH, talking in 2000 that race is not a useful concept, and then in 2005 that it is. So I would argue that we remain stuck in this. Now, what's interesting about Dobzhansky is that by the end of his career, he finally comes to reject the race concept. In 1962, in his book, Mankind Evolving, he expressed his worry that the investigation into human diversity had floundered in confusion and misunderstanding, and that these confusions, quote, were only partly due to the biases and passions engendered by race prejudice and consequent defense reactions. Dobzhansky believed that ultimately the problem that now faces the science of man is how to devise better methods for further observations that will give more meaningful results. And as a way to make his point, Dobzhansky cited several approaches to the race concept in biological studies that identify anywhere between 5 and 32 identified races. Now, the biologist in him wasn't inherently critical in this in these differences, because for him as a scientist, race could be a useful concept as in the context of evolution, but race had a very specific social meaning. And by 1962, with the civil rights movement on the rise and with the arguments of some in the anthropological and biological communities using race to justify the oppression of African Americans and to put down the civil rights movement, he realized that we needed something better, something different. What's interesting is that just before he writes Mankind Evolving, he has a row with a well-known evolutionary anthropologist named Carlton Kuhn, who wrote a book in the early 1960s called The Races of Man. Well, it turned out that Kuhn's cousin was a guy named Carlton Putnam, who was a notorious racist who published these little pamphlets that were sent out throughout the South during the 50s and the 60s as a way to try to undermine the civil rights movement and as a way to stoke racial hatred. Well, Kuhn was feeding information about what he believed to be the genetics of race to Putnam, who was then publishing it in his tracts. So you could see the way in which this works. These ideas were working their way into social thought as well. Now, let me conclude by saying that the history of the biological race concept undermines its use as a variable in biology, in science and medicine. Now, I believe it's the job, and Dobzhansky called this, more than 40 years ago, it's the job of evolutionary biologists, population geneticists, evolutionary anthropologists, and statistical geneticists to develop a better way of understanding human difference that, as a starting point, lessens and eventually helps eliminate the racist baggage that has been part and parcel of the study of human diversity for more than a century. And if geneticists either actively or passively continue to embrace Dobzhansky's paradox, then the field must be prepared to take responsibility for the side effects of this decision. I believe we know enough to heed Dobzhansky's warning about the nature of race and its utility as a biological variable. The question is, will we do something about it? And we're seeing this now with debates about personalized medicine. I was at a conference a few weeks ago, the genetics and ethics meetings out in Colorado. And there are still those geneticists who insist that race is a real and viable variable for study in biological thought. They hope that someday we'll get to a point where we can sequence everybody's genome quickly, but we're obviously not there yet, although the technology continues to explode. So we'll see what happens. So I thank you for your time, and thanks for coming out today.